G20 summit, which begins tomorrow, hosted, of course, in Delhi. Representatives of the world's largest economies, amongst them US President Joe Biden, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, you have French President Emmanuel Macron, you have Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman and Japan's Fumio Kishida. All of them will be descending on the national capital. But what does it mean for India and the way that it is being perceived in the world? In fact, to discuss this, joining us today on our show, United States India Business Council President, Ambassador Atul Keshap. Also joining us, United Kingdom's India Business Council CEO, Richard McCallum. Welcome, gentlemen, to our show. Ambassador Keshap, I'm going to be coming to you first. Well, first of all, of course, thank you for joining us here on Times Now. We are, of course, on the cusp of something very significant that is happening in India, the G20 Leaders Summit. Prime Minister Modi, he's just landed back in Delhi. Well, he was in the United States just a few months back. How is the USIBC viewing India's G20 presidency and what are its expectations from it?
First of all, thanks for having me on the show. I think India has had a fairly tremendous and impactful G20 year. If you think about the vision that India has telegraphed to the entire world through the over 200 meetings that have taken place during this G20 host year, and all of the various topics that have been covered, and all of the many thousands of delegates that have come to India, the vision is positive. The vision is one that I think most Americans would admire. And it reflects, I think, that very positive vision that India has for itself and for the entire world across the 21st century. It's one that's very citizen-focused. It is inherently democratic and focused on human freedom. And it's focused on the empowerment of human beings to live healthier, happier, more sustainable lives, whether in India or, frankly, all around the world. So I think it's actually been a very, very positive G20 year in terms of that vision.
Well, absolutely. We're looking forward to that. But Ambassador Keshap, for you, what are going to be the key takeaways that you'd like to see, especially when it comes to trade and on the business front in this joint communique? After all, the G20 is an economic grouping. So what are some of the outcomes that you are awaiting?
What I would like, as the head of the oldest and largest American US-India Business Advocacy Council, is I would like a real pathway forward to intensify what the leaders have already set out, which is that the United States and India, as the world's two largest democracies, trust one another. We, in fact, are part of the same high-trust ecosystem, that we, of course, share enormous strength in terms of digital economy and high-tech research and accomplishments, and that we should create pathways that make it easier for our two private sectors and our two governments and our two peoples to work more closely together on the technologies of the future that will ensure human freedom and ensure the prosperity of America and India through the entire 21st century. These include the technologies that are covered under the rubric of the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies that was set out by the two governments, and that we at the Chamber were happy to help launch. This includes things like IndusX, which is the defense framework for future collaboration. I'd like to see more of that between our two democracies. And certainly the G20 is a large grouping, but really what's critical is that the US and India continue to double down on their trust in one another.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are all looking forward to that, isn't it? In fact, Mr. McCallum, if I can come to you, as per you, what are your expectations from the G20 summit and some of the big key takeaways that you hope are going to be culminating?
Yes, certainly. And thanks very much for having me on. I'd like to start, I think, by just commending India for a brilliantly run G20 presidency. I've been really struck by the amazing dynamism in the country over the last year, bringing together global business leaders and academia and representatives of the science community. An amazing sense of energy. And we really saw that at the B20, which I attended a few weeks ago. Now, the B20's made some recommendations to the G20, and UKIBC support those recommendations, particularly things such as the harmonization and collaboration on digital corridors between trusted partners, and the promotion of cross-border R&D and technology cooperation. policies which support the net zero transition, particularly sustainable finance, and also industry academia partnerships to improve employability in an international market.
Absolutely.
Those are the things that we'd like to see come out of the G20.
Well, those, of course, are the positives. However, Ambassador Keshap, if I can come to you, while you've already spoken about how India and US are committed to deepening their economic cooperation, what are going to be some of the challenges also that you foresee?
Look, we've come a long way together. The relationship of today between Delhi and Washington and between our two countries is absolutely amazing compared to what it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's been utterly transformative. So what I'd like to see now is a sustained pathway by both governments toward real trade facilitation for your companies in America, for our companies in India, because we do trust one another and we are invested in the happiness and well-being and freedom of our citizens. We should view each other as friends, as welcome friends who can help build each other's economies. Indian companies are investing really well in the United States. They employ people in rural America and in urban America. They get a lot of facilitation from state governors and from the federal government. And I want to see more of that because it's good for my country. And I want to see that happen toward our companies in India as well. There's been a transformation of attitudes in terms of being pro-business and market-friendly in India. And I want to see us really work on that pathway so that our GDPs grow, our prosperity grows, and frankly, we can rely on each other more and more because frankly, we do trust each other. The pandemic has proven that.
You're absolutely right about that. In fact, Ambassador Keshap, India has been negotiating the free trade agreements with UK as well as the EU. But as far as the United States is concerned, what are some of the potential obstacles that you can see for such an agreement to come to any kind of fruition? And in the absence of an FTA, how do we further deepen and expand our frontiers of the terms of trade?
So I wish India all the success in the world with stitching up and negotiating these free trade agreements with the UK, Canada, et cetera. These are our allies, they're our friends. And I wish that we could also get on that track. Now, you understand how politics are in my country. And so it's a tough moment to push through free trade agreements, but we ought to have an ambitious goal. And Delhi and Washington ought to work toward that goal. I have seen complete transformation for the positive, for the better, in our trade relations over the last couple of years. You know, just recently during the state visit, the two governments agreed to take 6 different complaints off the table at the World Trade Organization in Geneva and committed to working bilaterally as friends to resolve these issues. That's what friends do. And so I would hope that Delhi and Washington would do even more in this regard to create a positive framework and a positive vibration for our trade relationship. Realize that we rely on one another, we trust one another, our companies are helping build our societies and the happiness of our people, and that would create the conditions for a free trade agreement. I recognize this could take a long time, but you know, there's a few shlokas that are important to keep in mind. Ease of doing business, level playing field, regulatory and legislative predictability. These things are really critical to attracting high quality investment, creating really high value jobs, and creating real GDP growth and prosperity. They can be framed within a trade agreement, and it's good to have that framework. Companies feel comfort in having a free trade agreement that enshrines the rights and obligations of each party. And so I encourage both governments to move toward that. But we have definitely turned a corner in our relations, and I appreciate and applaud how much friendship there is between our two trade bureaucracies at this juncture.
Well, absolutely. That's something that we've all looked forward to. In fact, Mr. McCallum, let's also talk about the hopes of a UK-India FTA. Of course, that is under the process right now. What are the possible challenges that need to be addressed and ironed out for this to go through, especially the G20 initiative?
Yes, good question and very topical. I think there are a few aspects to cover here. The first thing to understand is that the UK-India relationship is broad and deep and multifaceted. The UK is working with India towards a 2030 roadmap ambition, and there are 5 pillars to that, and trade is just one of them, alongside other areas of cooperation for example, defense, for example, the living bridge between the two countries. But the economic relationship is already flourishing. We've seen trade rise by 34% in the year ending March 23. India remains the #2 investor in the UK, and UK companies are thoroughly invested in India, employing something like 450,000 people in India. So it's already a good story, but of course it can improve, and our members are looking forward to a successful FTA as we work towards doubling trade by 2030. I think a landing zone is in sight for the FTA, although clearly there are still some gaps that need working on. People are working very hard at it. There's strong political will of both sides to make it happen. But you know, when the 5th and 6th largest economies in the world undertake a free trade agreement, it's important that we get that right, right for both sides. And I think finally, you know, the FTA is obviously very important, but I think of it not as the conclusion of a process, but as the start of a process. It opens up avenues for further collaboration. It's a foundation on which to keep building this relationship.
That's very interesting. You see, FTA is the starting point and not the end point. Gentlemen, do stay on with us. We must slip into a short break. But on the other side, we are also going to be speaking to Mr. McCallum about what happens about the visa regulations for Indians, especially the skilled labour in UK. Do we expect any relaxations on that? Ambassador Keshap as well as Richard McCallum continues to stay with us.